The night was silent except for the crackling sound of a broken pod resting in the tall grass. Inside the wreckage, a tiny alien girl curled up, her body trembling with fear. Her large glowing eyes watched the shadows move outside, and every sound made her heart race faster. Her people had abandoned her during their escape, leaving her behind because she was too small, too weak, too slow. Alone now, she clutched her knees tightly and whispered in her own tongue, "Please don't eat me." Over and over again, she remembered the stories told to her since childhood. Stories about humans, the beasts of the galaxy. They were said to be wild and dangerous, creatures who could crush bones with bare hands and devour flesh without mercy. Her elders told her to run if she ever saw one. But tonight, there was nowhere left to run. Through the smoke of the pod, she saw a tall shadow moving closer. The figure was broad and strong, carrying something long in one hand, and her tiny body shook even harder. The human stepped into the moonlight, his face dirty from travel, his clothes torn by the wilderness. He looked huge compared to her, towering like the monster from her nightmares. She held her breath, hoping he would pass without noticing, but his eyes caught the faint glow of her skin, and he stopped. The man slowly crouched down, lowering his weapon to the ground, and peered inside the broken pod. The alien girl let out a soft whimper, curling deeper into the corner. She whispered again, "Please don't eat me." Though she knew he could not understand, the human tilted his head, confused by the small, trembling creature before him. Instead of reaching out to grab her, he extended his empty hand, palm open. His voice was deep, steady, and gentle. "It's okay, little one. I won't hurt you." Of course, she could not understand the words, but the tone made her pause. Her people always described human voices as terrifying, but his sounded warm, almost soft. She stared at his hand, unsure what he wanted. If she moved closer, would he snatch her up and eat her? If she stayed, would he drag her out anyway? Her stomach growled loudly, betraying her hunger, and the human noticed. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small packet of food. Opening it carefully, he placed it on the ground just inside the pod, then backed away slowly. The girl blinked in surprise, tilting her head. Why would a beast offer food instead of teeth? Minutes passed, her hunger growing stronger. At last, she crept forward on shaky legs and sniffed at the strange food. It smelled warm, rich, unlike anything she had eaten before. She took the smallest bite, her eyes never leaving the man. He sat still, waiting patiently, showing no threat. The taste filled her mouth, and for the first time in days, her stomach felt less empty. Confusion filled her heart. Why would a beast feed prey? The human gave a small smile when he saw her eating. He spoke again in his strange tongue, his tone calm and steady. She still could not understand, but she no longer heard the growl of a monster in his voice. Instead, it almost sounded like comfort. When she finished, she crawled back to the corner, still wary. Her body trembled less, though, and her eyes stayed on him. He slowly stood, lifting his bag, and pointed to the trees beyond. Then he gestured toward himself and finally toward her, as if saying, "Come with me." Her heart pounded. Go with him and risk becoming his meal. Stay here and die of hunger or be found by raiders. Her small fingers gripped the broken metal of the pod. The stories in her mind battled with the moment before her eyes. Humans were beasts, yet this beast gave her food. Humans were monsters, yet this monster's eyes looked kind. The girl swallowed hard and whispered one last time, "Please don't eat me." Then, with slow steps, she climbed out of the pod, her tiny frame shivering in the night air. The human bent down and wrapped his cloak around her shoulders. She froze, expecting pain, but instead felt warmth. The fabric was rough, but it shielded her from the cold wind. He lifted his weapon again but kept it pointed at the ground, never at her. As they began to walk through the grass, the alien girl looked up at the stars. For the first time, the endless sky did not feel so terrifying. The beast was beside her, and though fear still clung to her chest, A new feeling began to stir. A question, what if humans were not what her people had always said? The walk through the forest felt endless. The tiny alien girl stayed close to the human. Though her legs shook with every step, her mind screamed at her to run. Yet her body obeyed the warmth of his cloak. The ground was damp, leaves crunching under their feet, and strange cries echoed from the dark trees. Every sound made her flinch, but the human did not react. He walked steady, like nothing in the night could harm him. To her, that was the most terrifying thing. How fearless the beast seemed. After some time, a faint glow appeared through the trees. Smoke drifted above, and the girl smelled fire. Her breath quickened, her old fears returning. Was this where he kept his victims? Was this where he ate them? The human led her into a small clearing where a camp stood. There was a tent of rough fabric, tools scattered, and a fire burning bright. The flames painted his face in orange light, making him look fierce, almost otherworldly. She froze at the edge of the clearing, whispering again, "Please don't eat me." The human turned, noticing her hesitation. He set his weapon against a tree and raised both hands slowly, showing they were empty. His voice was calm again, low and steady. "Safe here, little one." Though she could not understand, still the way he spoke made her pause. Instead of dragging her forward, he crouched by the fire and poked at the wood with a stick. The sparks danced into the air, and she couldn't help staring. Her people had fire too, but here, in the middle of this dangerous world, the fire felt alive, felt like protection. The human pulled out another packet of food, but this time he didn't place it near her. Instead, he carefully tore it open, divided it in two, and took a bite himself first. She blinked, confused, watching him chew slowly. Then, with a nod, he offered the other half to her. Her stomach ached with hunger, but fear still gnawed at her heart. Was this a trick? She hesitated, then remembered the taste of the first food he gave her. Her trembling hand reached out, and she snatched the piece quickly before he could change his mind. The taste was warm, salty, strange, but safe. She ate in silence, her eyes never leaving him. When she finished, the human pulled out a rough blanket and laid it across the ground near the fire. He gestured to her, patting the blanket. Her heart raced. Was this a trap? But the fire was warm, and the night air was freezing. Her small body shivered until she finally gave in. She crept to the blanket and sat down, curling her knees against her chest. The cloak he had given her still wrapped around her tiny frame. The human didn't come closer. He simply sat on the other side of the fire, staring into the flames. She realized he was giving her space, something her own people rarely did. The silence stretched, broken only by the fire's crackle. The girl watched him, studying his face carefully. His jaw was strong, his hair messy, his eyes tired. There were scars on his arms, faint but real, proof of battles he had survived. A beast, yes, but also something more. When he noticed her gaze, he gave a small smile. It wasn't sharp like fangs, it wasn't mocking, it was soft, and for the first time her chest felt lighter. The human spoke again, pointing to himself. "John." She tilted her head, not understanding. He tapped his chest once more. "John." She whispered back a shaky sound, copying, "John." He nodded, smiling wider. Then he pointed at her, waiting. She hesitated, then whispered her own name in her native tongue, "Leary." The sound was soft, almost like a secret. He repeated, "Leary," carefully, not mocking her. Her heart skipped at the sound of her name spoken by the beast. The fire burned lower as the night deepened. A strange calm settled over her. Her eyes grew heavy, though her fear whispered she should not sleep near him. But her body betrayed her, leaning against the rough blanket. Her last thought before drifting into dreams was a whisper in her mind. Maybe beasts do not share their food. Maybe beasts do not smile. Maybe this human is not the monster she was told about. In the middle of the night, thunder rolled above. The girl woke suddenly, heart pounding. The The human stirred too, standing quickly and checking the camp. When the wind howled and rain began to fall, he rushed to cover the fire with stones and pulled the tent flap open. He gestured for her to come inside. She hesitated, but the storm's roar was too strong. Cold water soaked her skin, and she finally darted into the tent. Inside, the space was small but warm, smelling of leather and smoke. The human sat near the entrance, keeping his weapon within reach. He did not lie down close to her. He kept distance, showing again he meant no harm. The storm raged outside, but within the tent, she felt something strange. She was not only safe from the rain, she was safe from the monsters of the night, because the beast she feared most was sitting guard beside her. And her last whisper before sleep returned was softer this time. "Please don't eat me." But now it almost sounded like a joke, and though she couldn't understand his words, the human answered with a gentle tone. "Rest, Leary, you're safe." Morning light broke through the thin fabric of the tent. The storm was gone, leaving the forest damp and fresh, the air cool with the smell of rain. The tiny alien girl, Leary, stirred awake, her cloak still wrapped tightly around her. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. Then her eyes widened when she saw the human sitting near the entrance. He was awake, sharpening a blade with calm, steady movements. The scrape of metal against stone echoed in the small space, and her chest tightened with fear again. But then she noticed his weapon was pointed away from her. His eyes soft when they met hers, not a beast, not a predator waiting to strike, but something different. Her stomach growled loudly, and she quickly covered it with her hands. Embarrassed, the human chuckled softly, a sound low and strange but not cruel. He reached into his pack, pulled out more food, and offered it to her. This time, instead of grabbing it quickly, she hesitated, her glowing eyes searching his face. Slowly, she reached out and took the packet. She chewed carefully, her mind racing with confusion. Why would a beast feed her again? Why would he not harm her while she slept? After they ate, the human tapped his chest once more and said, "John." Then he pointed to her, waiting patiently. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Leary." He repeated it, clear and gentle, "Leary." A shiver ran through her body. Not of fear this time, but of something new. She realized he was trying to learn her name, to speak it with respect. Her kind had always said humans only growled or roared. Yet this beast spoke softly, carefully. The day passed slowly, filled with silence and small gestures. John led her outside, showing her how to gather dry wood. When she brought back sticks too small, he shook his head gently, then found larger ones and placed them in her hands. When she dropped them, too weak to carry, he didn't laugh, he simply carried them himself. Later, he showed her how to drink from a stream safely, pointing at the clear running water, then at his lips. She copied his motion, whispering the word he used, "water." Though her accent bent the sound strangely, John smiled at her effort, repeating it slower, "Water." She tried again, "Water." And this time, his smile grew wider. Step by step, word by word, she began to understand. Her fear did not vanish, but curiosity pushed against it. Every time he taught her something, she whispered in her mind, "Please don't eat me." Yet each time he proved he wouldn't. The more she learned, the more the stories in her head cracked like fragile glass. At night, when they sat by the fire, John pointed at the flames. "Fire," she repeated softly. "Fahir." Her small voice carrying through the clearing. He nodded proudly, clapping once, and she couldn't help but let out a nervous giggle. It was the first sound of joy she had made since her people abandoned her. The human didn't mock her laughter. He smiled quietly, as if it warmed him too. Days turned into a rhythm. John hunted small animals in the forest, always keeping the meat far from her at first. She flinched, remembering the stories of humans eating anything. But he never forced it on her. Instead, he cooked roots, plants, and fruits he found, offering her the parts she could eat. He ate the rest himself, showing her she was safe. Sometimes he pretended to eat first, exaggerating his chewing, making her giggle again. Little by little, she began to sit closer to the fire, closer to him. One evening, when the stars glittered above, Leary tried something new. She pointed at him, then at herself, then clasped her small hands together, her people's way of asking, "Safe?" John tilted his head, confused, then slowly reached out his hand, palm up, hesitant, trembling. She placed her tiny hand in his. His skin was warm, rough, but steady. He nodded once, his deep voice rumbling, "Safe." She whispered it back, broken but clear, "Safe." In that moment, the space between beast and child grew smaller, but shadows still lingered in her heart. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she dreamed of teeth and claws. She would wake with a gasp, clutching her cloak tightly. John never came too close, but he always sat up, speaking softly. Though she didn't understand the words, his voice was enough to calm her. It was as if the sound carried a promise, that he would never harm her. The forest around them was still dangerous, filled with creatures and raiders. But inside that camp, near that fire, Leary began to see a truth her people never told her. Humans could be dangerous, yes, but they could also be kind. Kindness was its own language, one even she could understand. And as the fire burned low, she whispered her old phrase again, but softer now, almost playful. "Please don't eat me." John laughed this time, shaking his head, and answered in a voice she almost understood. "No one's eating you, little one." For the first time, she fell asleep with a smile. Not because she trusted fully, not yet, but because she finally felt hope. And that hope was stronger than fear. The forest looked calm under the pale moonlight, but Leary had learned the forest could never be trusted. It was filled with noises that made her heart quicken. The snap of branches, the cry of unknown beasts, the whisper of leaves carried by the wind. She stayed near the fire as John sharpened his weapon, his face serious, his eyes fixed on the trees beyond. Something about the way he sat tonight made her uneasy. He was not relaxed like before, he was listening, every muscle tight. Leary hugged her knees, her small frame glowing faintly in the firelight. Her people had told her once that humans feared the dark, that they were clumsy in the shadows. But looking at John, she realized that was another lie. He looked like he belonged to the night, like the shadows obeyed him. Her fear grew heavier, yet she couldn't look away. If even the dark couldn't frighten him, what could? A sudden sound came from the distance, a branch snapping loudly. John rose at once, his hand on his blade, his body moving with silent strength. Leary gasped and backed up against the tent, her heart hammering. She whispered, "Please don't eat me." Out of habit, though she knew the sound came from something else. John crouched low, scanning the trees, his eyes narrowing. Then he motioned to her, pointing to the tent flap, telling her to hide. She shook her head, terrified, but obeyed, crawling inside and clutching the blanket tightly. Outside, she heard footsteps, many of them, moving through the underbrush. Voices followed, harsh and guttural, not human but alien. Her blood turned cold. They were raiders, scavengers who hunted the weak and sold survivors for profit. They had come for her, she was sure of it. Her people had left her behind, and now these hunters would finish what abandonment started. She peeked through a small gap in the tent flap and saw figures moving closer, their armor glinting in the moonlight. John stood firm near the fire, blade in hand. The raiders shouted at him in a language she half understood, demanding he hand over the tiny one. Her breath caught, they knew she was here. Tears filled her eyes, her whole body shaking. She whispered again, "Please don't eat me." Though this time it wasn't for John, it was for the nightmare outside. John's answer was not in words. He raised his weapon, the firelight catching on the steel, and stepped forward. The raiders lunged, their blades flashing. Leary covered her mouth to stop from screaming as the fight began. The sound of metal clashing, the grunts of effort, the crash of bodies hitting the ground. It all echoed through the clearing. John moved with terrifying power, blocking, striking, pushing the attackers back. One raider tried to circle toward the tent, toward her, but John cut him down before he got close. For every step they gained, John forced them back too. To Leary's eyes, he looked like a storm made flesh. A beast, yes, but a beast protecting, not destroying. The stories of humans had painted them as mindless killers. But this man fought not for blood, but for her. Tears blurred her vision as she realized the truth. This monster was the only reason she was still alive. The fight raged on until the last raider fell, crawling back into the shadows of the forest. The clearing grew quiet again, broken only by John's heavy breathing. Blood dripped from his arm, his clothes torn, his chest rising and falling like thunder. Leary trembled, expecting him to turn toward her with the same fury he showed the raiders. But when he looked at her, his eyes softened instantly. He lowered his blade and whispered words she could not understand. But the tone was enough. He was telling her she was safe. Her legs wobbled as she crawled out of the tent, her tiny form shaking. She saw the bodies around the fire, saw the danger that could have taken her. Then she looked at John, standing wounded but strong, and a strange sound left her lips, a sob mixed with relief. She ran forward without thinking, her little hands clutching his rough arm. "Please don't eat me," she whispered again. But this time the words were broken by tears. John knelt slowly, lowering himself to her level. He touched her head gently, his hand heavy but warm. "No one's eating you," his deep voice said softly, though she only understood his tone. The fire crackled between them, lighting the scars on his face, the sweat on his skin, and the quiet strength in his eyes. For the first time, Leary's fear of him shifted completely. Yes, he was a beast, but he was her beast. And when shadows filled the forest, she realized there was no one else she would rather have by her side. That night, she slept close to him for the first time, not because he forced her, but because she chose it. Her tiny body curled near his cloak, her heart finally finding rest. The world outside was cruel, but here in the shelter of fire and steel, she had discovered something her people never taught her, that humans were not monsters. They were protectors, and John had become hers. The fire burned low, glowing embers crackling in the quiet night. Leary sat close to John, her small form wrapped tightly in his cloak. She could still smell the sharp scent of blood from the battle, though the bodies of the raiders were gone, dragged into the forest by scavenger beasts. Her heart had not stopped racing since the fight. Yet when she looked at John, her fear slowly softened. He had fought like the monster of her people's stories, but not against her, against the ones who wanted to harm her. It made no sense, yet it was real. John sat silently across from her, cleaning his blade, his face serious, his arm still bleeding from a cut. She wanted to say something, but the words in her tongue would mean nothing to him. Her glowing eyes followed his every move. Finally, she whispered her old phrase again, "Please don't eat me." Though her voice carried a faint smile this time, John looked up, tilting his head, and let out a small laugh. He repeated something in his language, his voice calm and warm, and even if she could not understand, she felt his meaning. He was telling her she was safe. The night grew colder, and Leary pulled the cloak tighter. Her stomach was heavy not with hunger, but with something else, the weight of secrets she had carried since birth. Her people's stories, their warnings, their hatred of humans. They filled her mind. She wanted to tell him, to share the truth of why she feared him. But how could she when they barely understood each other? The next morning, the forest seemed calmer, the storm and the raiders gone. Leaving behind damp earth and soft sunlight, John worked quietly, repairing the tent, fixing broken straps, moving with steady hands. Leary watched him for a long time, her thoughts restless. Finally, she crawled closer, her small fingers tugging gently at his sleeve. When he turned to her, she placed her hand on her chest. "Leary," she whispered. Then she pointed to him. "John." He nodded, smiling, repeating both names slowly. She hesitated, then pointed at him again and mimicked sharp teeth with her hands, growling softly. John frowned, confused. She tried again, this time crouching low like a frightened child, shaking, then pointing at him. Beast, she whispered in her language, though he could not understand. John's eyes softened as he realized she was trying to tell him something. He set down his tools and listened, his head tilted slightly. Leary hugged her knees, her voice trembling as she spoke in broken words, mixing her tongue with the ones he had taught her. People say, humans eat, she stammered. Humans, bad monsters. Her eyes filled with tears, the memory of her people's voices echoing in her head. John's face changed, not angry, not offended, but sad. He shook his head slowly and tapped his chest. Human, he said clearly. Then he spread his hands wide, pointing to the food he gave her, the cloak, the fire. Not monster. His voice steady. Leary's lip trembled as she tried to understand. She repeated softly, not monster. As if testing the words, John nodded, his eyes kind. For the first time, she felt the barrier between them break just a little. That night, as the stars shimmered above, Leary sat by the fire, her glowing eyes reflecting the flames. She whispered again, but softer now, please don't eat me. John shook his head with a faint smile, placing a hand on his chest. Safe. The word was one she understood now. She repeated it carefully, her small voice clear. Safe. The word felt strange on her tongue, but it warmed her chest like the fire warmed her skin. Later, when the fire burned low, John unwrapped a small object from his pack. It was a photograph, faded, worn by time. He held it in his rough hands and stared at it quietly. Leary tilted her head, curious. She crept closer, peeking at the image. It showed humans, a woman and a child, their faces bright with smiles. John's voice was heavy when he spoke their names. Words she didn't understand, but she saw the pain in his eyes, the longing. Her heart tightened. For the first time, she understood he carried his own secret too. He was not just a beast, not just a protector. He was someone who had lost, someone who carried wounds deeper than scars. She reached out hesitantly, her small hand brushing the edge of the photograph. Then she placed her tiny palm gently against his chest, over his heart. Safe, she whispered again. But this time, it was for him as much as for herself. John's eyes softened, his rough hand covering hers gently. No words were needed, the secret was shared. Her people had lied, calling humans beasts. But here, beside the fire, Leary discovered a truth stronger than fear. Humans were not monsters. They were broken, they were scarred, but they were kind. And in the quiet night, the little alien girl realized something she never thought possible. She was no longer alone. The days in the forest began to blend together. Morning light through the trees, the sound of running water in the stream, the fire at night, always glowing, always safe. Leary no longer flinched every time John moved, though her heart still carried tiny echoes of fear. But now, alongside fear, there was something else, something new. Trust. John showed her how to carry water in a container without spilling, how to gather fruit from high branches, how to light a small fire when he was away. At first, her hands fumbled, her steps clumsy. But he never grew angry, never shouted. Instead, he showed her again and again, repeating patiently. She found herself smiling when she succeeded, and each time, John gave her a nod or a small grin, the kind that made her chest feel warm. One evening, when the fire was bright and the air calm, Leary watched John carefully. His hands were strong, covered in old scars, proof of battles and pain. But when those hands lifted a pot of food or offered her a blanket, they were gentle. Her people had always said human hands were made to destroy, but she saw only care. She tilted her head and whispered softly, "Heart, human." In her broken words, John looked at her, confused for a moment. Then his eyes softened. He touched his chest, over his heart, and repeated slowly, "Human heart." The phrase echoed inside her, simple yet powerful. The forest was not without danger, though. Strange beasts prowled at night, their cries distant but chilling. Sometimes John would leave to hunt, and each time, fear twisted her stomach. Would he return, or would the forest swallow him like it had swallowed so many of her people? But always, without fail, he came back, his steps heavy, his cloak wet from rain, his arms full of food or supplies. Every return felt like a victory. Every return made her trust grow deeper. One afternoon, she tried to help him patch his torn cloak. Her small fingers struggled with the thick needle, but she pushed through. John watched her, amused, but did not take the task away. Instead, he sat beside her, guiding her hands slowly. When she finally tied the last knot, she looked up, waiting. Would he laugh at her crooked stitches? But he only gave her that quiet nod of approval. Her heart leapt with pride. As the days passed, Leary began to see more than a protector. She noticed the way he sat alone sometimes, staring at the old photograph from his pack. She noticed the lines on his face, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought she wasn't looking. He carried pain, just as she did, though he never spoke of it. One night, when the firelight flickered across his tired face, she crept closer and whispered, "Safe," placing her small hand gently over his. For once, it was not her asking for safety, it was her offering it. John looked at her, his eyes shining with something she didn't understand. But it made her chest ache in a strange, new way. She started to laugh more, small giggles that escaped when he exaggerated his lessons, when he pretended to trip on purpose while gathering wood, or when he made silly faces after tasting bitter fruit. Her laughter filled the camp, light and fragile, but real. And each time, John smiled as if her joy was a treasure. For a girl who once believed humans were beasts, she now felt something very different. Maybe humans were not monsters at all. Maybe they were the ones who carried the strongest hearts. But the forest did not let them forget its dangers. One night, howls echoed close, closer than ever before. John grabbed his weapon and moved to guard the camp, his body tense. Leary's heart raced, her small hands clutching the blanket. But this time, instead of hiding, she stood and moved beside him. Her legs shook, but she whispered, "Together." In her broken words, John glanced down at her, surprise in his eyes. Then he gave the smallest nod. They faced the shadows side by side. And though the beasts never came into the clearing, the moment remained, a memory carved into her heart. Later, when the fire burned low, she looked at John and whispered the words she once feared. "Please don't eat me." But now it carried a teasing tone, almost playful. John laughed softly, shaking his head, and answered gently, "No one's eating you." She smiled, for the first time without fear. The truth was clear now. Her people had been wrong. Humans were not beasts. They were protectors, teachers, companions. And in John, she had found all of those things. That night, before she fell asleep, Leary whispered a final phrase, "Heart of human, strong." John didn't understand all her words, but he repeated them anyway, his voice steady, "Human heart." And as her eyes closed, her small body curled near the fire, she realized something she never thought possible. The beast she had once begged not to eat her had become the reason she felt alive. The fire burned low, glowing embers crackling in the quiet night. Leary sat close to John, her small form wrapped tightly in his cloak. She could still smell the sharp scent of blood from the battle, though the bodies of the raiders were gone, dragged into the forest by scavenger beasts. Her heart had not stopped racing since the fight. Yet when she looked at John, her fear slowly softened. He had fought like the monster of her people's stories, but not against her, against the ones who wanted to harm her. It made no sense, yet it was real. John sat silently across from her, cleaning his blade, his face serious, his arm still bleeding from a cut. She wanted to say something, but the words in her tongue would mean nothing to him. Her glowing eyes followed his every move. Finally, she whispered her old phrase again, "Please don't eat me." Though her voice carried a faint smile this time, John looked up, tilting his head, and let out a small laugh. He repeated something in his language, his voice calm and warm, and even if she could not understand, she felt his meaning. He was telling her she was safe. The night grew colder, and Leary pulled the cloak tighter. Her stomach was heavy not with hunger, but with something else, the weight of secrets she had carried since birth. Her people's stories, their warnings, their hatred of humans. They filled her mind. She wanted to tell him, to share the truth of why she feared him. But how could she when they barely understood each other? The next morning, the forest seemed calmer. The storm and the raiders gone. Leaving behind damp earth and soft sunlight, John worked quietly, repairing the tent, fixing broken straps, moving with steady hands. Leary watched him for a long time, her thoughts restless. Finally, she crawled closer, her small fingers tugging gently at his sleeve. When he turned to her, she placed her hand on her chest. "Leary," she whispered. Then she pointed to him. "John." He nodded, smiling, repeating both names slowly. She hesitated, then pointed at him again and mimicked sharp teeth with her hands, growling softly. John frowned, confused. She tried again, this time crouching low like a frightened child, shaking, then pointing at him. "Beast," she whispered in her language, though he could not understand. John's eyes softened as he realized she was trying to tell him something. He set down his tools and listened, his head tilted slightly. Leary hugged her knees, her voice trembling as she spoke in broken words, mixing her tongue with the ones he had taught her. "People say, humans eat," she stammered. "Humans, bad monsters." Her eyes filled with tears, the memory of her people's voices echoing in her head. John's face changed, not angry, not offended, but sad. He shook his head slowly and tapped his chest. "Human," he said clearly. Then he spread his hands wide, pointing to the food he gave her, the cloak, the fire. "Not monster." His voice steady. Leary's lip trembled as she tried to understand. She repeated softly, "Not monster." As if testing the words, John nodded, his eyes kind. For the first time, she felt the barrier between them break just a little. That night, as the stars shimmered above, Leary sat by the fire, her glowing eyes reflecting the flames. She whispered again, but softer now, "Please don't eat me." John shook his head with a faint smile, placing a hand on his chest. "Safe." The word was one she understood now. She repeated it carefully, her small voice clear. "Safe." The word felt strange on her tongue, but it warmed her chest like the fire warmed her skin. Later, when the fire burned low, John unwrapped a small object from his pack. It was a photograph, faded, worn by time. He held it in his rough hands and stared at it quietly. Leary tilted her head, curious. She crept closer, peeking at the image. It showed humans, a woman and a child, their faces bright with smiles. John's voice was heavy when he spoke their names. Words she didn't understand, but she saw the pain in his eyes, the longing. Her heart tightened. For the first time, she understood he carried his own secret too. He was not just a beast, not just a protector. He was someone who had lost, someone who carried wounds deeper than scars. She reached out hesitantly, her small hand brushing the edge of the photograph. Then she placed her tiny palm gently against his chest, over his heart. "Safe," she whispered again. But this time, it was for him as much as for herself. John's eyes softened, his rough hand covering hers gently. No words were needed, the secret was shared. Her people had lied, calling humans beasts. But here, beside the fire, Leary discovered a truth stronger than fear. Humans were not monsters. They were broken, they were scarred, but they were kind. And in the quiet night, the little alien girl realized something she never thought possible. She was no longer alone.